Jeff, hello. It's an honor to have you, and it's been great to see you on Elephant with some excerpts, I believe. Um, and Rasha, one of our editors, is a big fan and shares your work constantly. And have you met Rasha?
I have. I think she's fantastic.
Yeah, because she's up in Toronto. So grounded spirituality, I think, it's a fantastic title. Right now, spirituality. Well, always, I think, since the 70s when Trungpa Rinpoche wrote Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, I think people think of spirituality as this sort of this kind of idealistic thing. And then people get involved in spiritual communities or spiritual practice, and it's frustrating and it's disappointing and it's irritating. So what the heck is grounded spirituality? Like, why did you write this? What's your thesis?
Let me show the book cover first.
Please. There it is.
Context for what I'm talking about.
Yeah, thank you.
400 pages. I think for me, my experience of this thing called spirituality really began in body-centered psychotherapy. I really knew nothing about spirituality, but I worked with Al Owen, who was a co-founder of bioenergetics. And my experience at the end of those very intense physical somatic release sessions, before I would walk into that house of his, I would feel kind of separate from everything, the horse farm, the house, the guy who drove me to the house. And then I would go deep into the body, excavate the material that I was holding in my body.
You mean like tension or?
Yeah, well, he did a lot of tantruming. He has a breathing stool, bioenergetics, that you go back over and open the holdings, and then encouraging crying and release. You do a lot of anger work on a foam cube. So it's really about excavating the holdings and releasing the material.
Anger work on a foam cube would be a great.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Follow up.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. My film Carmageddon, if people check out the trailer, they'll see me smashing Bhagavan Das's face and shredding his picture with a baseball bat. So that's bioenergetics.
Right. So it's engaging in the tension and the anger and the neurosis and
just clearing the emotional debris that's held in the body itself, not as a cerebral construct, but as a felt experience. Right. So at the end of those experiences, I would leave his house and I would feel at one with everything, integrated, a unity consciousness experience. It didn't happen on the meditation cushion. It didn't happen through witnessing the pain body. It happened through engaging the pain body, moving the debris that I was holding, clearing the fragmentation and feeling woven and reintegrated, rethreaded, and absolutely present in my feet first. So for me, that was my experience of spirituality. So then, and I said to Lowen at the end, I said, why are they talking about spirituality? What are they talking about? And he, to paraphrase him, he said, oh, you just ground, you energize, you clear the emotional material, you become spirited. That's real spirituality. And that was my experience. So then I encountered this thing called the spiritual world. I made Carmageddon. I talked to Ram Dass. I confronted him on his bypassing. I was with Bhagavan Das, lived in my house for 8 days. So I got to see what the spiritual bypass feels like in your home.
That must have been quite in 8 days. Yeah.
It was quite an experience. And all of that didn't seem to be taking me or leading me in the direction of my experience of an integrated, grounded, woven, embodied version of spirituality. They seem to be talking about something dissociated from my humanness, as though spirituality existed distinct from my human experience. And I found spirituality right in the heart of my humanness. So for me, grounded spirituality is embodied, grounded, inclusive, presence as a whole being experience rather than presence as an experience of perfecting a singular thread of consciousness, mastering it. I call it masturbation. They call it mastery or realization. And for me, masturbation is pretending that because you've mastered a singular thread of consciousness, you're absolutely enlightened when every other part of your life is a total shit show. Right. So for me, grounded spirituality is about everything weaving together, humanness and spirituality becoming indistinguishable from each other, and presence and purpose also ultimately becoming indistinguishable. When I perfected singular threads of consciousness and didn't integrate them and weave them with all other aspects of my humanness, I couldn't find my path and purpose. When I went into my body and cleared debris and rewoven myself, rethreaded myself, I always got the next glimpse of a clarified path with respect to purpose. So
just slow down for the students in the back here. So by a singular thread, you mean you get one thing right, whether it's whatever it is, some teaching, but the rest, maybe your kitchen sink is a mess, or your relationships are a mess, or you're still caught up in your, how your parents brought you up. It hasn't integrated more fully into your life. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, sort of spirituality seen as either a transcendent experience, which just feels preposterous to me because we're not birds, we're human.
Right.
Or it's about becoming a master meditator, which is certainly possible.
But there's some ambition in that. There's some kind of goal oriented.
Yeah, it's they bash the ego, but they're completely being motivated by the ego itself. I mean, it's all filled and riddled with contradiction.
And that's kind of okay, because the ego can kind of dupe itself, like Trojan horse itself, into getting you to the meditation cushion, which then cuts the ego. Like in Buddhism, they call it the self-burning flame, or the self-cutting sword of practice, meditation practice.
Got it. So for me, meditation is a great example. So just to simplify it. So I did this insight and opening workshop with Stan Groff and Jack Cornfield at the Governor Dumber Academy in Massachusetts. And I thought, this is perfect. I'm going to get out of my head and I'm going to get dumber and I'm going to find my body. So we'd sit with Jack, and Jack tell all those beautiful, sweet stories with that soft voice of his. And all I saw was rage in Jack's eyes. And it was a perfect mirror reflection of me, because all I saw was rage in my eyes.
Wow.
And I looked around the room and everybody's sitting still, all these caffeinated Westerners, and we're all trying to meditate and do Vipassana and calm down and center ourselves. And everybody's just moving around and annoyed and agitated, including me. Right. So and I was doing bioenergetics, so I had a different way to do this. Right. So then I did holotropic with Stan Groff, and on the second one, I went wild. I mean, 3 hours that felt like 3,000 years and 3 minutes at the same time. I kept throwing the assistants off of my back. I kept energizing and re-encountering my mother, my Auntie Tilly. All kinds of stuff came through my body, and I threw my mother off my back symbolically through the physicality. At the end of that experience, Waylon, I went outside and sat before this big field of bulrushes that before the holotropic seemed separate from me.
Right.
And I would sit in front of it, and before sitting with Jack, and I would sit in front of it after sitting with Jack. Nothing changed. But after the 3-hour holotropic breath work, I sat in front of the bulrush field and I felt completely unified and present for it.
Yeah.
So again, I had the same experience. If I went through the body into the body and made my human experience and my sacred experience the same thing, I could access a unity consciousness field. And when I tried to separate it out and perfect, for example, a Vipassana meditative consciousness and not integrate and energize and clear the emotional debris, I felt completely fragmented.
But don't you think, I mean, honest question, from my experience, like I've been meditating for a million years and I'm still a mess, but, I love my meditation practice because it helps me, as you say, kind of ground and feel present instead of caught up in my stories. I'm present with the bulrushes. I remember when I was like 16 or 17, I came back to Carmichaeling in Vermont, the Buddhist center, and meditated for a weekend. And I walked outside, very similar moment that your bulrushes anecdote reminded me of, where I went out and I was like a neurotic, insecure, arrogant, speedy, full of energy, 16, 17-year-old. And I looked at the pond and the willows and I just was present and everything seemed so vivid. And it was a delightful experience. And, that was through meditation. So so I guess that's a long way of saying, don't you think meditation maybe is just more boring and takes a while to integrate?
I think meditation can be incredibly useful and helpful for all kinds of different reasons.
Yeah.
But I think that if we're not also going deep down into the heart of the body, the bones of our being, and clearing the emotional debris that's primarily creating all of the unhealthy relational and worldly patterns, then it really is primarily a spiritual bypass maneuver. It's meditation is medication.
And for people, just real quick, for people who aren't familiar with that term, what is spiritual bypass?
It's using something, and I'm going to reframe it, but it's using something that we call spirituality to bypass unresolved emotional issues and challenges dealing with the world itself.
And that's where a lot of the sort of like worshipy kind of theistic tendencies arise, where you're like, finally, I'm going to be part of this community that is, everything's going to be perfect and I'm going to wear a funny outfit. You kind of play
and change my name like Ram Dass did, and change my name.
I'm gonna act spiritual, kind of, instead of actually. Spirituality, as you say, is really like the charnel ground in Buddhism. You know, the phrase charnel ground. It's all about like getting into the yuck and the muck and kind of getting through that. Like the lotus, you know, grows out of the mud and is this beautiful flower.
I mean, the way I think of it is that what we've been calling the spiritual bypass is a spiritual bypass, but in a different way. I don't think where people going when they're bypassing their unresolved stuff is actually spiritual. I think they're dissociating from the spiritual. Because for me, spirituality means, and this is, I think, consistent with what you just said, spirituality is reality. So if you're in the greatest number of threads of reality, you're actually having a more spiritual experience. So they are spiritually bypassing, but they're bypassing spirituality.
I love that.
I talked about that in Grounded, right?
That is so good. That's such a beautiful koan, and that's so healing in a way, because the problem isn't spiritual. Well, maybe the problem is spirituality in quotes, but real spirituality is dealing with reality, like you said.
It's enrealment. It's presence as a whole being experienced. Can I read a body-centered quote?
Yeah. So this is not only connecting with you, but highlighting your book, and really encourage people to check out Jeff's book here.
So this one's actually from Articulations, which is just a book of my popular quotes.
Okay.
Okay. It's page 27. It's not all in your head. It's all in your heart. It's all in your feet. It's all in your hips. It's all in your shoulders. It's all in your breath. It's all in your body. Anything unattended to, unresolved, unhealed, and unprocessed lives in your tissues, your cells, your musculature. It may be manifest in your thinking, but it doesn't begin there. The mind does not source itself. The body does. The trick is to not try to shift your thinking from within the mind itself. You can't. You may be able to subdue it there, but you won't be able to resolve it, because the troubling thoughts are merely a symptom of the deeper issues. They're a reflection of our emotional holdings and constricted musculature. They emanate from the fleshy trauma tunnels that we dug in order to survive this world. Many of us sit in the waiting room of awakening for decades, waiting impatiently for our new birth. Yet it never arrives because we're looking for it where it isn't, within the mind itself. Babies aren't born that way. You have to go down into the depths of the body to bring a new birth to life. Down, down, down into the alchemical chambers of new thought, your magnificent body. This is where we're born again. Close quote. The reason I wrote that is because for me, the monkey mind didn't mean anything. It was like getting inside of the mind, witnessing the mind, fucking around in the mind, but never really changing anything. It felt like a very safe, patriarchal, dissociated, avoidant way of pretending that I was awakening in my 20-hour meditation practice every day, when the moment I stepped into the village, back into relationship, left the meditation cave, everything was crazy again. So for me, I began to realize, and this experience with Lowen had a lot to do with it, that really the issue was the monkey heart. That if I could clear the emotional debris, like when you have a really good, intense, activated cry, my mind calmed down. The monkey mind just dissipated. And I know why people don't want to do it that way, because now they got to confront their material. So they want to stay up here and witness in here and blame the mind and work in the mind and witness the mind. And I get sometimes that's advantageous. I was a witnesser at an early age. But for me, the monkey heart's the real issue. If we drop down into the material and somatic experiencing, bioenergetics, core energetics, clear the emotional debris, the mind calms down. Simple.
Yeah. So I come from the Buddhist tradition, so that's sort of my reference point. But in the Buddhist tradition, very similarly, they kind of make fun of people who stay up here, who do all the intellectual, or, who read a lot of books. Like there's a famous story of Naropa that you may be familiar with. He was the greatest intellectual of his age. And this old lady came up and confronted him and said, all this stuff, show off your learning to me. And he did that, and she danced around and she was happy. And then she said, but do you actually understand it? And challenged him on his actual embodiment of that philosophical knowledge. But to me, if the body were just it, so this is a question as well, but kind of a challenge, then wouldn't Michael Jordan be, the Buddha? The body is one piece, working with the mind is one piece, working with emotions. Why not? Why can't we all be friends? Every way.
Well, I think we can, but I think if we keep prioritizing the mind and surviving by our wits and head tripping our way through life,
Right.
we never come into the proper and true alignment and integration of body and mind. I think the mind should be doing the soul's bidding. I think the mind should be doing the body's bidding. The mind should be serving the gratification and satisfaction of the emotional body. So the mind is absolutely, utterly relevant. I couldn't write these words without a potent mind.
Sure.
But I don't want my mind to rule the roost as a survivalist, in a survivalist consciousness, you need the mind all the time in order to survive. But in a more authentic consciousness, which is, I think, the bridge crossing that we're all on right now, I think we need to come into integration with the soul's journey. Why are you here? What's your sacred purpose? In survivalist world, we define who we are by what puts food on the table. So we use the mind all the time in order to organize that and stay safe. And we have to do that. But I think the place we're moving towards now, and I don't see the Buddha as the ultimate symbol of where I have any interest in going. I think Al Owen's a far better version of it for me, because he was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, enlivened in his heart. I could feel him. Yeah. He wasn't detached. For me, detachment is a tool. It's not a life. It's just a tool. It's a helpful, useful tool. But it's not ultimately what it means to be alive inside of this beautiful, magnificent human form, which I think happened from the feet up. Yeah.
Right. Agreed. Yeah. I mean, I do think there is a sort of veneration in the Buddhist tradition for crazy, wild, happy Zen monks who run around doing art and loving life and, having lovers. And so I think joy is certainly a good measure if it's genuinely grounded in your being, and not just sort of exploiting others for joy, which a lot of us do in this society. But so in turning around, because I've watched a couple of your interviews, how does this grounded spirituality address the issues of our time, which, we briefly mentioned in the green room, but climate crisis, the kind of, my freedom is more important than your life kind of COVID philosophy that's going on in the US and elsewhere. And I know that's just my view of it, and then, the kind of Trumpian urge to the cult, what do you call it? The cult of personality, where you worship a person instead of investing in democracy. I feel like democracy, climate crisis are pretty major challenges. How does embodiment address that?
I think it's the only thing that can address it. I mean, if I watch a Trump rally, I see a bunch of emotionally armored, hardcore, old-style survivalists transferring all their daddy stuff onto, ironically, the daddy who cares about them less than any daddy ever could. I mean, so for me, embodiment is the only answer, because the alignment between purpose and presence for me is everything. We have to get here before we can figure out why we're here. And getting here for me means dropping down into the body, clearing the emotional debris, learning the lessons at the heart of that material. Every time I access the next step on my path in this life of purpose was through the emotional debris clearing process. I created space inside for the purpose to reveal itself. And in the accessing and learning how to hold the space for all that shadow material, I matured emotionally. So for me, emotional maturity and spiritual maturity are synonymous. If you can't hold the space for your emotional process, you can't hold the space for anything really in this world. That's my experience, at least.
Yeah.
So for me, purpose, the further I went into presence, the more access I had to what I call sacred purpose, my reasons for being in this lifetime. To be a lawyer and work with Eddie Greenspan came through my body. To study humanistic psychology, those truth chills I had when I would read Maslow was like, yeah, man, this is a direction for you. The truth aches I would experience when I pulled away from my path and purpose told me I was moving in the wrong direction. It all came through the body, the feeling in the body of, yes, this is where I belong. No, this is not where I belong. And additionally, the calling to write, for example, always came through the clearing of emotional debris. I began to write Soul Shaping right after 2 weeks of emotional clearing at Harbin Hot Springs. So what was the purpose of all of that? It was to get presence as a whole being experience, not as a perfection of a particular thread of consciousness while omitting everything else, like being a brilliant mind who's not in his body, or being really athletic but not aligned emotionally or particularly sharp. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah, so for me, presence and purpose become a portal to each other. And eventually, when you do this for long enough, they become ultimately indistinguishable. The here and the why become the same bloody thing. So if we want to have a whole
that was so I gotta chill there. That's just beautiful. The presence and purpose become aligned.
They become, and then ultimately indistinguishable. You become your calling. Your calling is your portal to divinity, and divinity is your portal back to your calling. To me, this is the only way. So all these wonderfully benevolently intended spiritualists who keep perfecting singular, like become like Eckhart Tolle, master meditators, but clearly not alive in their bodies and their emotional body. They're not going to take us to a place of purpose.
Real quick, I'm not that familiar with Eckhart Tolle other than some quotes. Like, why do you say clearly not aligned in his body? Like, how do you know?
Sit before him, listen to him, fall asleep while he's talking to you. And read the beginning of The Power of Now, a book I call The Power of Self-Avoidance, where he talks about how he's suicidal and one morning he wakes up and he's enlightened. Therapists call that dissociation. People who want to sell product call that self-realization. So it's up to you which way. And that's not to say he doesn't have some tools and techniques. They always do. But that is not leading us to an enlivened, embodied, spirited, relational experience of purpose in this world. And if we don't get a bunch of enlivened, inspired, engaged individuals dealing with the challenges of our time, nothing's going to happen. We're not going to change anything. Remember the movie 2012 with John Cusack? There's a poster image for it. And you have a bunch of monks sort of in meditative repose on the top of the mountain. Yeah. And it's like they've found it. They have found ecstasy. The world is an illusion. And then you see the water coming to destroy and kill them and to remind them, this world ain't no illusion, baby. So we need a spirituality that gets us in our bodies, in our feet, in our hearts, in our experience of whole body presence, so we can find the true offering that we're here to bring to the world and start bringing it. And we understand collectively, culturally, how the marketing and corporate worlds keep us small and shamed and shunned, so we keep buying their bullshit products and never know how brilliantly, magnificently empowered we can be in this lifetime. And I think the only way to do that is get people embodied, here, enlivened, supported in that, so they can figure out why they're here, and then we can fix this thing.
I think that is a bias in the Buddhist community for many years, which has been corrected, I think, over the last 20 years, but is the whole, like, the body is an illusion kind of thing. And then at a certain point you realize, like, a bunch of meditators, like, have creaky bones, and, you know, you need to move. You need, like, the Buddha himself had to realize he needed to sit on a kushagrass cushion, and he needed to eat some oatmeal, and he needed to take care of his body. And that's when he attained enlightenment, not when he was trying to pretend like he didn't have a body or trying to torture his body.
That's what he attained, what he calls enlightenment. You know, I mean, I'll tell you, when I started writing against patriarchal spirituality and the New Cage movement, I have more hate letters and threat letters from Buddhists than from anybody else. So can I read you a definition of patriarchal spirituality?
Can you just collect all those letters and publish hate letters from Buddhists? That's hysterical and tragic.
And terrifying at the same time.
Yeah. Don't worry, I get some of that too.
Yeah, I believe you.
And I'm not even a teacher. I'm an idiot.
Can I read you a definition of patriarchal spirituality that came through me years ago? Okay.
Please.
So patriarchal spirituality, those ungrounded and inhumane spiritual models that have been fostered by emotionally armored, self-avoidant men. These models share some or all of the following beliefs. The ego is the enemy of a spiritual life. The monkey mind is the cause of suffering. Your feelings are an illusion. Your personal identifications and stories are necessarily false. Witnessing your pain transforms it. Your body is a spiritually bankrupt, toxic quagmire. The only real consciousness is an absolute and transcendent one. Stillness and silence are the path. Isolation is the best way to access higher states. There's no self. Meditation is the royal road to enlightenment. Enlightenment actually exists. Formlessness over form. The ultimate path is upward and vertical. Real spirituality exists independent of our humanness. In fact, most of the above is a blatant lie. Here's a more accurate hypothesis about the nature of human life. A healthy ego is beautifully essential to healthy functioning. The monkey mind is fed by the monkey heart, the unresolved emotional body. Many of our identities and stories are fundamental to who we are, where we've been, why we're here. Healing your pain transforms it. Watching it is only a preliminary step. Our bodies are our spiritual temples. The only real consciousness is one that integrates all that we are and all that this is. Stillness and silence are only one path. Many people prefer movement and sound. They like stillness and silence because their stuff doesn't come up. Movement and sound bring up their stuff. I'll continue though. There's no higher state. We aren't birds. Connection may be the best way to access deep and horizontal states. There's a magnificent self. The work is to align it with sacred purpose, not to deny it. Meditation is not the royal road. It's one road, and it's not any more effective than embodied movement and emotional release as a clarification and transformation tool. Enlightenment doesn't exist. Enrealment does. Be real now. And it's a relative experience, changing form as we in this changed form. We are form, and we are here to inform our humanness rather than formlessness. If there's an ultimate path, it's downward, rooted and horizontal. There is no distinction between our spirituality and our humanness. So
I would challenge you on like almost every one of those in a positive way, and say the Buddhism that I have been trained in would agree with like 97% of what you just said.
Right, but not the way it's been co-opted in the West.
Oh, perhaps. But I think, you know, in Buddhism, formlessness is just one quality of reality. You know, form and emptiness, emptiness and form. You know, in the Heart Sutra, it talks about form and formlessness. It's just saying that, like, you know, things aren't solid in the way our ego wants them to be, but they do exist and they are real. And I actually think you and Buddhism would get along pretty well. Maybe the Buddhism in the West and the hate letters is saying you're taking away our Buddhism or something, but
well, I'm taking away their dissociation. But it would be interesting if for you and I to pick a text and to read the text and then talk about the text.
I would love to, and honestly, my mom would love to. Like, I could go through point by point everything you just said, and like pretty much I agree with almost everything there. I think you take a couple pot shots at Buddhism that are like hard to agree with because I don't think they're representing an accurate notion of Buddhism. But if you're taking on Buddhism in modern Buddhism, that could be a fair portrayal of the misunderstanding of Buddhism, for sure.
Let me ask you this question. So based on your experience of Buddhism, the pure form version of Buddhism,
what is the pure form? Like,
well, it's not the modern co-opted version of it. What you're talking about, the thing that integrates what
like genuine Dharma, yeah.
Do you feel as though that contains within it the seeds of transformation that will allow us to pull ourselves out of the situations that this species has got ourselves into? Or is the fact that Buddhism is so popular and we're still dealing with climate change and the destruction of democracy and all the rest of that, tell us that we need a new version of religion or spirituality that actually somehow helps us to meet those challenges?
I would almost
also fucked up if this thing was so right on.
Totally. I mean, I remember when I was a kid pointing at some super neurotic, like very patriarchal Buddhist teacher guy and saying, he was more of a student, but he also taught, and saying, hey, if Buddhism, I was a very cynical teenager, you know, like all teenagers, I guess. And I was like, if Buddhism works, why is he such a neurotic mess? Right. And the other Buddhist, I was at the retreat center, said kind of humorously, they kind of shrugged and said, well, you don't know what he was like 30 years ago. And I love that answer because I do think people are effed up. You are, I am, we all are. And then we are given spirituality. Some of that spirituality is genuine and we can incorporate it into our being, and some of it is false and we can be misled. But I do think, in my experience, Buddhism has just been incredibly helpful in terms of, and I do think it includes the emotions and the body. And I think Buddhism does have a bias where the body is less important, but that's a misunderstanding of Buddhism by humans, not the actual teachings, if you pay attention.
So for you, if you look at your experience, your integration of Buddhism into your life, acknowledging, as you just did, all the ways in which it's helped you and benefited you, in what ways does it not actually help or benefit you? Like what's left unattended to within your own psychological or relational healing experience that Buddhism doesn't really have the answer for?
Well, one of the many things I loved in your list of the sort of patriarchal, ridiculous list of sort of Buddhism, or whatever that list was the witnessing is maybe the beginning of dealing with your neurosis or your habitual patterns, but it's just the beginning. That's all. I do feel like I have, Buddhism is really great in my experience, on confronting our ingrained habitual patterns, which I think affect the body, the emotions, the mind, the monkey heart, all of it. But I'm still, personally speaking, I'm still neurotic. I'm still, out of my body regularly. That's where I feel like meditation is helpful. It brings me back, actually, ironically, into my body and into presence and into purpose. But I'm still a mess, but I love that Buddhism, it allows us the space to acknowledge that. Like Maitri is making friends with yourself. And like any friendship, if we were best friends, I would, or you would say, look, Jeff or Waylon, you're being a jerk in your relationship, or you're a mess, or you're not treating your body well, you're overeating or over drinking. We'd be honest with each other. And I think I can be honest with myself about where I'm at. But I'm definitely not enlightened. I agree. Enlightenment is this weird, I've never related much to enlightenment.
Well, it's so interesting, but what's so interesting is that we're conditioned to look up when we talk about it. And this whole notion of higher than, which is, to me, is part of the bypass and is part of the masculine's desire to get away from the painful experience of the human experience. Can I read a paragraph that Andrew Harvey wrote? Okay, because I want to know what you think about this. Okay, this is in Andrew Harvey wrote the foreword for Grounded. So he says, for me, Jeff Brown, forget that part. The ancient alchemical path has 3 stages. First, profound experience of transcendence that reveals divine identity. This is what Andrew says. This makes obvious the truth of what's written in the Upanishads, you are that. The patriarchal traditions have mistakenly taken this stage for enlightenment. But the alchemist, so that's the first stage, witnessing, for example, or the crack open to a unity moment, or whatever that is. But the alchemist knew that this was only the first stage. The second stage is the stage that Jeff is, forget that part. This is where the deep knowledge of the transcendent and the forces aroused by that knowledge are consciously integrated step by step with mind, heart, soul, and crucially, and more importantly, the depths of the body. So that's stage 2. As the second stage, so in other words, whatever you figured, and I have a different view of this. I actually think that if you start in the body, your experience of this thing called transcendence is a different qualitative experience. And in fact, you don't need it anymore because you're already experiencing the God self as the self. But as the second stage progresses, which is the integrations of immanence and transcendence, the third stage, which is called the simple thing, starts to emerge. And for this stage, there are very few descriptions because very few people have truly matured in the mystery of profound union with all that this stage brings. Jeff Brown knows the glowing fringes and his experience that happens in grad. Right. So you start there, you do the thing, and then you bring the thing here, and then you weave it all together as a whole thing. And then it becomes maybe the way I was describing presence and purpose becoming indistinguishable. You just become woven as the being who's really here, but also I call it Western consciousness. It's like you bridge the quest, the oceans of essence, which is the emphasis in the East, with the individual droplet of meaning, which is like the building of the healthy self-concept in the West, in just the right perfect place where you're not so self that you're narcissistic, but there's enough self to know that you matter and you have something to bring, and you're connected to the oceanic at the same time. And that would be maybe the closest we'll get to something called enlightenment.
I love that.
Yeah. You're not better than anybody. You're just really here for everything and you can hold everything.
Yeah. In Buddhism, there's a similar notion, and I'm sorry I keep referring to that, but that's my wheelhouse of reference point, but of natural hierarchy, which says, you find your purpose to be a benefit in your own particular droplet way to the ocean, and the ocean includes yourself. So it's not just selfless. It's, you're trying to be a benefit, but it's to all sentient beings, which includes yourself, but it also includes sentient beings that drive you nuts, and sentient beings you don't think about or care about that much, and sentient beings you love and adore, and sentient includes everyone. And that's natural hierarchy, that we all find it's not about some people are better than others. It's natural hierarchy. Everyone finds their way to connect to their purpose. Everyone does kind of matter individually. I think that's great. And I do think that can be undermined often in spiritual thought.
the bashing of the self. I mean, they call it self-realization. It's usually self-annihilation, actually,
Right.
in the quest for this something called the absolute self. If we don't honor the localized self, honor the brilliance and beauty of the human form, nobody is going to feel empowered enough, healthily egoic enough to bring any good offering to the world to help fix this species.
Beautifully.
We really got it. Yeah.
A really inspiring quote for me when I was a kid was Marianne Williamson's quote about like sort of embracing yourself. You're like, who are you not to, shout and be wonderful and be bold and be yourself?
Right.
You're brilliant, and your brilliance allows other people to express their brilliance. Like, you don't have to be ashamed. In Buddhism, the culture that I grew up in, there was a culture of be very self-deprecating, which I still am. Be very don't shine, be very modest.
Think about that. All this brilliance that lives inside of every human being, all these offerings, all these pathways of possibility, and they're not allowed to manifest them, to excavate them, to embody them. Imagine walking down the street where everybody's actually doing that. I mean, what a lived experience to be around that. And how could we not help but fix this trajectory of the species if that's the state humanity's in?
And I think, interestingly, not to, walk into dangerous alligator-infested territories, but I think, interestingly, a lot of white men who are spiritual write about patriarchal spirituality as a way to kind of be woke or to kind of be self-deprecating, when really the message of the patriarchy is systemic and abuses, as Liz Plank, who I interviewed, a feminist. Patriarchy is bad for men, is bad obviously for women, is bad for all of us. And men have obviously taken advantage of the patriarchy for millennia, but we need to realize it's not our friend. Being a toxic masculine, rah, I'm tougher than you, being vegan is wimpy, that whole kind of thing.
Survivalism.
Is actually shown to be really bad for your health as a man.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're like too tough to ask for directions, so you get lost. Is that cool? Like,
you're not allowed to take care of yourself. Not allowed to tend to your unresolved feelings. You're not allowed to acknowledge your vulnerability, your shadow. So you're basically living a completely incomplete existence.
It's so sad. And so many movies still do that. I think movies have improved a little bit, like action movies, in that the tough dude will make fun of himself or be made fun of. But it's still such a thing for children. You look at, The Rock or whatever, and they're like these huge, massive, buff dudes saving the world. But so maybe final question. We all need to kind of save the world in terms of climate crisis, but saving the world isn't like enlightenment isn't an external thing. It begins in our life. So has grounded spirituality made you kind of take care of your body and take care of your environment and, become an environmentalist and kind of healthy person in some way? You know what I'm asking?
I mean, I think finding my callings absolutely transformed the way that I relate to everything in my life, including people. But I don't think with respect to the environment that I'm up to speed yet in the way that I need to be. Yeah, I think in that way that I'm not. I've been so focused on this individuated writing voice piece, and I think now I'm moving more actively into some kind of a sacred activism structure.
But I also think like your writing voice is delightful and really connects really well. And if you, like finding your presence and your purpose, like you talked about, like you don't even have to become something else to become an activist. You just have to use your grounded spirituality. If you're kind to your body and you make friends with your body and your mind and your heart, will naturally make you kinder to the planet and to other people. And I would think.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. I mean, I think if we invite everybody in the direction of wholeness, they're much more likely to understand. Because I think what happens for me, the more I reached the stage where I felt kind of gratified within the self, I felt like I naturally began to look outward and to try to figure out what is my offering to the world. And so writing has been that offering for a period of time. If you're not feeling that way about the self, if you aren't allowed to or feel too shamed and shunned to develop and gratify the self, you don't reach the offering stage, or you reach it for the wrong reasons. So I think it's absolutely essential. So people say, so what's the best thing you would recommend people to do spiritually right now in this world? It's get into somatic psychotherapy. It's get into your body, clear the emotional debris that you're carrying from your ancestry and all the rest of it generationally, so you can get so fully here inside of this human form that you're then inspired to figure out what it is you're doing here. To me, the most spiritual practitioners in the world right now are somatic psychotherapists, because they're actually the ones most inclined to bring people actually into a lived experience of the sacred in the bones of their being.
So I guess a final PS, since I found it kind of delightful, like, so you're, because that's a really positive message that most people could agree with. But then if you look at like online reviews of your books and you talk about like hate mail, like a lot of people get pissed off by who you are or what you're saying.
Sure.
So where does that come in? Because that's so interesting to me that you find it worthwhile to challenge our kind of ideas of what a spiritual teacher is, and obviously people are so attached to their spiritual reference points, we're going to freak out.
Well, I think critical review of spiritual teachings is fundamental to the preservation of the species.
Okay.
And interestingly, the people who challenge me on that are quite comfortable critically reviewing political figures, corporate structures, media structures, religious structures. But somehow we were conditioned to believe, through the God-jectification of the guru, who's usually the most fucked up person in the room, in my opinion, that we're not allowed to review them. And they work that very effectively. Not allowed to be angry, not allowed to gossip, non-judgment. These are perfect rules and beliefs, new cage principles that allow the guru to get away with everything. So I think we absolutely have to critically review the new cage movement and all forms of spirituality and religion. And not because we're telling people where to go, but so they, at least if vulnerable people are going to step into these forums, there's other literature out there that gives them another perspective before they get sucked into the vortex of nothingness. And so I find it shocking that anybody would challenge. It's one thing to say, I don't agree with your view, Jeff Brown, but to challenge my right to have a view, this feels ultimately anti-democratic, ultimately truly preposterous. And I think if we have billions of people walking down dissociated spiritual roads, we are never going to fix what we need to fix as a species.
Yeah. And that's something, I mean, you didn't criticize about Buddhism that I would criticize about Buddhism. And I'm sure you've criticized it elsewhere, but, we're super culty sometimes. Like, we have these teachers who, like you said, are in some ways are wonderful and have great teachings and have great experience, but in other ways are the most neurotic, messed up people in the room. And I think
it makes perfect sense, because they've defined spirituality as something bereft of humanness. I mean, it's the perfect system to never have to attend to things.
Well, but it's weird because, like, when we grew up, I think the saving grace for me in terms of still appreciating Buddhism and practicing it is that I was always taught to question, and I was always taught to be critical, and I was always taught, ironically, to challenge the teacher and to be non-theistic, meaning not worshipful, respectful, but not worshipful.
That's great.
And so I always did that. And then growing up, I always got, and I'm sure many other people got criticized for being critical. But you're like, well, but this is what we were taught. And I agree with this. Like, I have critical intelligence and I don't think this is on, I don't think this is good. And so, in my Buddhist community, there's been all kinds of scandals over the last few years around our main teacher. And I think that's been great that that's been exposed, and it should be exposed, and we should all be kind to each other. But that doesn't mean I don't have empathy for everyone concerned. That it's a bunch of hurt people, hurt teachers, hurting students, and gosh, we're all messed up. But I think in every strata of society, I think, corporations, like you referred to it before, capitalism, corporations, marketing,
they want to keep you small, buddy. That's how they make their money. I mean, if you're empowered, centered, purposeful, all the rest of it, integrated, you don't need to buy stupid stuff anymore because you're already inherently gratified. And they know that. So they keep us shamed and shunned and questioning ourselves and underconfident and all the rest of it. This is what these systems do. And so what we need to do is move in the other direction and empower the individual in a healthily egoic sense, so that they love and value themselves and then figure out why they're here. It all just comes through that vehicle, I think.
Amen. Love that.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff, total delight. I think we could do this for 20 hours. I want to take a brief pause, and Molly, who is running this, if there's any comments or questions, seems like a lot of general comments. But Jeff, I really appreciate it. Would you mind holding up your book again? So Jeff Brown, Grounded Spirituality. If you want more, it's delightful, and it is grounded and delightfully free of what I call the tree fort password stuff. Like I felt like Andrew Harvey's, who's a great guy, but his introduction had so many terms where I'm like, what?
Oh,
like,
I see.
I just want to connect and understand instead of having this whole like spiritual fancy language.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah. But good guy. And I'm sure you can figure out what those words mean. Okay. Jeff, thank you so much.
Thanks, buddy. I enjoyed our talk a lot.
Yeah. Well, we'd love to feature you anytime on Elephant.
We'll do it again. Thank you.
And thank you to Rasha, who knows you, for making this happen. She's a great editor at Elephant.
She's brilliant. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Jeff Brown, Grounded Spirituality. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.